This video will walk you through creating a partial invoice from a service order. When you're in a service order, you can change the invoice type to a partial. You can't change the invoice type if the work order has already been invoiced. I can change it to partial because this is still an open, uninvoiced order. With a partial invoice, you're allowed to create multiple invoices off one work order. So in this work order, I have 4 items added to the order that I need to invoice. With a partial, you can choose on the first invoice which items you want to include on the first invoice, and then you can do another invoice or a third or fourth invoice and choose which items you want to include on that invoice. So for example, since I've changed this work order to a partial type invoice and I have 4 items on this order, if I go and invoice the order, it's going to ask me which items I want to invoice. So maybe I only want to invoice for the material right now. So I can uncheck the 2 service items and just leave the material items checked. And when I click OK, it will go ahead and generate an invoice. You'll notice at the top this status went to invoice with 3 stars, indicating it's just been partially invoiced. And when you look on the order item tab, there are 2 items invoiced or marked as fully invoiced. The 2 service items, which I didn't pick in that window, are still showing as not invoiced. Now let's jump to the invoice. So you can go to the totals tab and jump to invoice. And let's find that invoice that was generated from that work order. So now we're looking at the invoice. If we go and preview what the invoice looks like, you can see there are 2 items on this invoice, the 2 material items I picked in the partial. If we go back to the service order, I can click the invoice button again and it will allow me to choose one of these service items. Or maybe I even need to add another service charge to this order. I'm just picking one and putting a charge on there. So when I click the invoice button again, I can choose any of these service items. So maybe I just want to charge for 3 of these the quantity of 3 instead of 6. I'm partially invoicing that one item even. So when I go ahead and generate that second invoice off this order, it's just partially invoicing that one service item. When you're on the service order, you can also go to the History tab, and it's going to show you all the invoice numbers and the items on each invoice. So the first invoice was 2787, and those 2 material items were on it. 2788 was one I just created it with a quantity of 3 of that hourly service item. I can double click on 2788 to jump to that invoice. So now when we preview that invoice, it has a quantity of 3 for that hourly service item. So far on that service order, we actually created 2 invoices because that service order is set to a partial type invoice. You can click that again and let me do my final invoice. I'm just going to include the rest of the items on this invoice. So those 3 are checked, and I'll just click OK. Now when we do that, notice this status, it just says invoice. It doesn't have the 3 stars behind it. And when we look at the order items tab, everything's been fully invoiced. When we go to the History tab, we're going to see another invoice number generated, 2789, and you're going to see the 3 items included on that invoice. So I'll just double click on one of the lines for the invoice number 2789, and we're on that invoice now. And let's preview that invoice. So you can see those remaining 3 items are showing on this third and last invoice for this work order.